The German occupation of Luxembourg in World War I was the first of two military occupations of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg by Germany in the 20th century. From August 1914 until the end of World War I on the 11th of November 1918, Luxembourg was under full occupation by the German Empire. The German government justified the occupation by citing the need to support their armies in neighboring France, although many Luxembourgers, contemporary and present, have interpreted German actions otherwise. During this period, Luxembourg was allowed to retain its own government and political system, but all proceedings were overshadowed by the German army's presence. Despite the overbearing distraction of the occupation, the Luxembourgish people attempted to lead their lives as normally as possible. The political parties attempted to focus on other matters, such as the economy, education, and constitutional reform. The domestic political environment was further complicated by the death of Paul Eyschen, who had been prime minister for 27 years. With his death came a string of short-lived governments, culminating in rebellion and constitutional turmoil after the withdrawal of German soldiers. Background: since the 1867 Treaty of London, Luxembourg had been an explicitly neutral state. The Luxembourg crisis had seen Prussia thwart France's attempt to purchase the Grand Duchy from the Netherlands. Luxembourg's neutrality was accepted by Prussia's then-Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, who boasted, in exchange for the fortress of Luxembourg, "We have been compensated by the neutrality of the country, and a guarantee that it shall be maintained in perpetuity." In June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the thrones of Austria-Hungary, was assassinated by pan-Slavic nationalists, leading to a sudden deterioration in relations between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Austria-Hungary was supported by the German Empire, whilst Serbia had the backing of the Russian Empire. On the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, which, in turn, required the mobilization of Russia, hence Germany, thanks to its responsibilities under the dual alliance. Anticipating a retaliatory declaration of war from Russia's closest Western ally, France, Germany put into action the Schlieffen Plan. Under this military strategy, formulated by Count Schlieffen in 1905, Germany would launch a lightning attack on France through the poorly defended Low Countries. This would bypass France's main defences, arranged to the south. Germany's army would be able to encircle Paris, force France to surrender, and turn its full attention to the Eastern Front. Since the 1860s, Luxembourgers had been keenly aware of German ambition, and Luxembourg's government was well aware of the implications of the Schlieffen Plan. In 1911, Prime Minister Paul Eyschen commissioned an engineer to evaluate Germany's Western Railroad network, particularly the likelihood that Germany would occupy Luxembourg to suit its logistical needs for a campaign in France. Moreover, given the strong ethnic and linguistic links between Luxembourg and Germany, it was feared that Germany might seek to annex Luxembourg into its empire. The government of Luxembourg aimed to avoid this by reaffirming the country's neutrality. Invasion. On 1 August 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. On the outbreak of war with its eastern neighbor, Germany put the Schlieffen Plan into action, and Luxembourg's government's fears were realized. Initially, Luxembourg was only a transit point for Albrecht von Württemberg's Fourth Army. One of the railways from the northern Rhineland into France passed through Trois Vierges, in the far north of Luxembourg, and Germany's first infringement of Luxembourg's sovereignty and neutrality was the unauthorized use of Trois Vierges station. Eyschen protested, but could do nothing to prevent Germany's incursion. The next day, while French troops were still at a distance from the German frontier, Germany launched a full invasion. German soldiers began moving through southeastern Luxembourg, crossing the Moselle River at Riemich and Wasserbillig, and headed towards the capital, Luxembourg City. Tens of thousands of German soldiers had been deployed to Luxembourg in those 24 hours. Grand Duchess Marie-Adélaïde ordered that the Grand Duchy's small army, which numbered under 400, not to resist, and, on the afternoon of the 2nd of August, she and Eichen met the German commander, Oberst Richard Karl von Tesmar, on Luxembourg City's Adolph Bridge, the symbol of Luxembourg's modernization. They protested mildly, but both the young Grand Duchess and her aging statesman accepted German military rule as inevitable. On the 2nd of August, German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg justified the complete occupation of Luxembourg in terms of military necessity, arguing that France was ready to invade Luxembourg itself. The French minister in Luxembourg dismissed this argument, claiming that it would not have considered violating Luxembourg's neutrality unless Germany had done so first. Bethmann-Hollweg attempted to prove his country's regret by offering Luxembourg compensation for the losses due to the military presence. On the 4th of August, Bethmann-Hollweg told the Reichstag. However, when it seemed that Germany was on the verge of victory, the Chancellor began to revise his statements. In his September program, Bethmann-Hollweg called for Luxembourg to become a German federal state, and for that result to be forced upon the Luxembourgish people once Germany achieved victory over the Triple Entente. Given this promise, it came as a great relief to most Luxembourgers that the British and French halted the German advance at the Battle of the Marne in mid-September. The result for the combatant nations was trench warfare, but, for Luxembourg, it was the indefinite continuation of German occupation. Eichen government. Just as the war was in the balance on the Western Front, so the fate of Luxembourg was seesawing back and forth. It was clear to all that the good conduct of the Luxembourgish government, if fully receptive to the needs of the German military administrators, could guarantee Luxembourg's continued self-government, at least in the short term. Eichen was a familiar and overwhelmingly popular leader, and all factions put their utmost faith in his ability to steer Luxembourg through the diplomatic minefield that was occupation. On the 4th of August 1914, he expelled the French minister in Luxembourg at the request of the German minister, followed by the Belgian minister 4 days later and the Italian minister when his country entered the war. To the same end, Eichen refused to speak ill of the German Zollverein, even though he had talked openly of exiting the customs union before the war began. On occasions, Eichen's principles got the better of him. On the 13th of October 1914, a Luxembourgish journalist named Karl Dada was arrested by the German army for publishing anti-German stories. He was then taken to Koblenz, and tried and sentenced by court-martial to 3 months' imprisonment. Eichen was outraged that the Germans had kidnapped a Luxembourgish citizen and tried him for an extraterritorial offense, and Eichen did nothing to hide his indignation. Eichen told the German minister in Luxembourg that the action was of direct injury to the Grand Duchy's national sovereignty. Such vexatious complaints were repeated by both Eichen and Victor Thorn. When a railway worker was arrested in January 1915 for allegedly working for French military intelligence, and subsequently tried and sentenced in Trier, as Minister for Justice, Thorn was incensed that the Luxembourgish legal system had been treated with such disdain. Such objections were not received well by the German authorities. Although they tired of Eichen's stubborn ways, he remained a useful tool to unite the various Luxembourgish political factions. On the 23rd of June 1915, a letter was sent to the Luxembourg government stating that the Germans considered Luxembourg to be a theatre of war and that the population, therefore, was subject to military law. Eichen was not alone in letting his principles obstruct government business. In the summer of 1915, Eichen pushed to further reduce the role of the Catholic Church in the state school system. Grand Duchess Marie-Adélaïde objected. A fervently religious Catholic, she was reputed to have said, "I will not allow their most precious heritage, Roman Catholicism, to be stolen while I have the key." Marie Adelaide refused to budge, inviting Aishan to resign if he could not accept her decision. Aishan nearly did, but decided to control himself. Nevertheless, he would not be long in the job. After Aishan's death on the 11th of October 1915, Luxembourg's political system was brought to its knees by the death of Paul Aishan. When war broke out, Aishan had been 73 years old, but his premiership of 27 years was the only government that most Luxembourgers had known. Throughout the first year of German occupation, he had been a rock for the Luxembourgish people. He had also been of great importance to Marie Adelaide. The Grand Duchess had never been groomed for the position, was 53 years Aishan's junior, and was considered both politically naive and dangerously partisan for a constitutional monarch. The recent strains were relatively cosmetic. Critically, Aishan had the confidence of the Chamber of Deputies, and he had managed to hold together a government containing all major factions, seemingly by force of personality alone. To make matters worse for national unity, the strain of occupation had broken apart the pre-war anti-clericalist alliance between the socialist and the liberal factions, thus depriving both the clericalists and anti-clericalists of a legislative majority. The Catholic Conservatives formed the largest bloc, but they were least likely to form a majority coalition. Munganast's government. The day after Aishan's death, Grand Duchess Marie Adelaide invited Matthias Munganast, who had been Minister for Finance since 1882, to form a minority government. Munganast's special status as a caretaker prime minister is underlined by his official title. He was not president of the government, as all other prime ministers since 1857 had been, but held the lesser title of President of the Council. Munganast's administration was never intended to be long-lived, and Marie Adelaide's main objective when appointing the experienced Munganast was to steady the ship. Nevertheless, nobody expected the government to fall as soon as it did. On the 4th of November 1915, Munganast nominated a new candidate for head of Luxembourg's École Normale. The nomination did not meet with Grand Ducal approval, and Marie Adelaide rejected him. Munganast persisted. Education had been a hobby horse of his, and he imagined that the Grand Duchess would accept the advice of a minister as experienced as he was. He was wrong. The Grand Duchess had always been single-minded, and resented a minority prime minister, particularly one so new to the job, making demands of her. The next day, Munganast resigned, just 25 days after being given the job. Luch government having fought with Munganast, the Grand Duchess decided to appoint an all-conservative cabinet led by Hubert Luch. The Chamber of Deputies was steadfastly opposed. The party of the right held only 20 seats out of 52, but they formed the plurality. Marie Adelaide sought to end this deadlock by dissolving the Chamber of Deputies and by calling for the voters to grant a mandate to the Conservatives. This outraged the left, which assumed that its deputies alone had the constitutional right to grant the government confidence. It was dubbed by those on the left a coup d'état by the Grand Duchess. Nonetheless, on the 23rd of December 1915, Luxembourg went to the polls. Although the position of the party of the right was improved, taking 25 seats, it fell a whisker short of winning an absolute majority. On the 11th of January 1916, the Chamber of Deputies passed a motion of no confidence, and Luch resigned. National Union government. Forming a consensus after the failure of the all-conservative government, the Grand Duchess turned to the leading liberal politician, Victor Thorn, to form a new government. After Aishan's premiership of 27 years, two governments had come and gone in 3 months, and the Luxembourgish people were becoming disillusioned with the failure of the politicians. Thorn's nature was to be a conciliatory leader, and he made a direct appeal to the Chamber of Deputies to support his government, no matter the deputies' individual ideological persuasions. If you want a government that acts, and is capable of acting, it is imperative that all parties support this government. This support was forthcoming from all parties, but only on the condition that each was invited into the government. Thorn was left with no choice but to afford them this. The resulting Grand Coalition cabinet included every leading light in Luxembourgish politics, besides Thorn himself. There were the conservatives Elie Kaufmann and Antoine Lefort, the socialist leader Dr. Michel Welter, and the liberal Elie Moutria. Food shortage. The most pressing concern of the Luxembourgish government was that of food supply. The war had made importation of food an impossibility, and the needs of the German occupiers inevitably came before those of the Luxembourgish people. To slow the food supply's diminishment, Michel Welter, the Director General for both Agriculture and Commerce, banned the export of food from Luxembourg. Furthermore, the government introduced rationing and price controls to counteract the soaring demand and to make food more affordable for poorer Luxembourgers. However, the measures did not have the desired effect. Increasing numbers of Luxembourgers turned to the black market, and, to the consternation of the Luxembourgish government, the German army of occupation seemed to do little to help. Moreover, the government accused Germany of aiding the development of the black market by refusing to enforce regulations, and even of smuggling goods themselves. Through 1916, the food crisis deepened, compounded by a poor potato harvest across all of the Low Countries. In neighboring Belgium, the harvest was between 30% and 40% down on the previous year. Although many Luxembourgers were on near-starvation-level dietary intakes, the country managed to avoid famine. In part, this was due to a reduction of German soldiers' dependence upon local food sources, instead relying on imports from Germany. Despite the avoidance of a famine, the Luxembourgish government lost much of the faith placed in it by the public and by the politicians. On the 22nd of December 1916, Michel Welter, the minister responsible, was censured by the Chamber of Deputies, which demanded his resignation. Thorn procrastinated, seeking any option but firing the leader of one of three major parties, but could find none. On the 3rd of January 1917, Welter was fired, and replaced by another socialist, Ernest Leclerc. Even after the change and von Tesmar's promise of his soldiers better conduct in future, Elie Kaufmann was capable of citing 36 instances of German soldiers caught smuggling foodstuffs between March 1917 and June 1918. Miners' strike. Discontent amongst the population grew constantly, particularly in the country's industrialized south. The autumn of 1916 had seen the first unionization within the iron and steel industries, with trade unions springing up in both Luxembourg City and Esch-sur-Alzette. Despite the war demand, iron production had slumped, leading to greater employment insecurity. In March and April, 3 independents were elected as deputies from the canton of Esch-sur-Alzette, where the economy was dominated by iron and steel. As independents, these newly elected deputies were the only legislative opposition to the National Union government. For many Luxembourgers, particularly the miners, expression of disgust at the government could not be directed through the ballot box alone. Sensing the threat of civil disobedience or worse, von Tesmar threatened any individual committing an act of violence with the death penalty. However, on the 31st of May 1917, the workers sought to use their most potent weapon, by defying von Tesmar's ultimatum and downing tools. Germany was dependent upon Luxembourgish iron, as the British Royal Navy's naval blockade forced Germany to look to accessible local supplies. In 1916, Luxembourg produced over 1/7 of the Zollvereins pig iron. As such, Germany simply could not afford a strike, lest it be deprived of critical raw materials. In putting down the strike, von Tesmar was ruthlessly efficient, but he was not required to resort to the executions that he had threatened. Within 9 days, the strike was defeated and the leaders arrested. The two ringleaders were then sentenced by German court-martial in Trier to 10 years imprisonment, to the disgust of the government. The continued refusal of the German authorities to respect the Luxembourgish government, and the humiliating manner in which the strike was put down by German military muscle rather than the Luxembourgish gendarmerie, were too much for Thorn. On 19 June 1917, the government resigned.